Humans are weird, aren't they? I mean, some of their behaviour is just plain bonkers, but is it inexplicable? Well, actually, I've discovered that much of human weirdness can be explained by a field of study known as evolutionary psychology, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video, which has been sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. Thanks to them, but more of them later. Now, this has got nothing to do with swords, so I suppose I should put this down. Now, evolutionary psychology does get a bit of a bad press sometimes, and I've come across a number of people who seem quite prejudiced against it. They seem to have been misled into believing all sorts of inaccurate things about it. So I'm going to start, if you like, with a bit of an introduction to it. Evolutionary psychology is something that I used to study at Newcastle University back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I was reasonably, for a while, cutting edge. You know, I was reading the latest papers and books that hadn't even been published yet. And I was talking to all the right people and going to conferences and all that sort of stuff. So I was, you know, finger on the pulse for a while. Admittedly, I'm a bit rusty now, but I was cutting edge once. And part of the reason for this is that I was researching a thing that I ended up calling Built for the Stone Age. And this was my attempt to break into telly. Yes, I was going to show everyone how you should do science on television, and nobody in British television would believe me. And so I make a pilot, I thought, just to show them that my ideas do work. So I made, at my own expense, a pilot, and I called it Built for the Stone Age, and I couldn't get anyone to consider sticking it on television. It seems that my mistake is that I just wasn't famous enough. That was my mistake. If only I'd known. And then YouTube came along and I thought, you know, I'll just stick it on YouTube. And so I did. So here's a link to the, I think, 8 episodes I cut it up into for YouTube of Built for the Stone Age. And you can find out what I look like without a bald patch. Now, I called it Built for the Stone Age because there is this idea in evolutionary psychology that we are in fact not adapted for this world, but we have evolved instincts instead which are appropriate to the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptation, that is to say the Stone Age, the Pleistocene, the Paleolithic, way back then. Although I imagine even the people back then would sometimes think, we humans, we're really odd, why do we behave like this? It's very strange. And even they could have benefited from the knowledge imparted by evolutionary psychology. So, it is founded on the bedrock of the idea that humans evolved. Now, you may think that, in fact, humans didn't evolve, that they were just conjured out of dust by gods, in which case, yeah, I'm not going to really be able to persuade you out of that, because that's a faith-based argument. But people who actually do stuff like look at the evidence are pretty much uniformly overwhelmed by it. The notion that we evolved, and animals and plants as well with us, really fits a massive wealth of evidence and explains an awful lot of things. Why do we have apparent vestigial tails at the bases of our spines? Why do we have an appendix? Why does our windpipe cross our food pipe in a really dangerous and daft way? Oh, it can be explained by evolution. Why is our skeleton almost identical to that of a gorilla? It's made out of the same stuff, in the same way, the bones are the same shape, arranged in the same order. The chances against that are billions to 1 against. The only difference really between a gorilla's skeleton and mine is just proportions. They've got bigger brow ridges and smaller brain. What's it? The bit that goes to the brain. The brain pan. Brain pan. I think it's called that. So yeah, it's just proportions, and proportions are things that can evolve quite quickly. So yeah, if you look at the evidence, you would imagine then that yeah, humans did evolve. So if my elbow evolved, then presumably my kidney evolved as well, because it's part of me, and how could one evolve and not the other? So if my elbow and my kidney evolved, then presumably my brain evolved. And since my brain creates my mind, that means that my instincts must have evolved as well. And you look at all sorts of animals all around the world, and they have these instincts, and they're clearly acting on them. They don't go to school. And most of the stuff that we do, we don't have to go to school. Do you remember, what your eyes are doing is incredibly complicated. You've got 2 eyes, for instance, and they've got to match those 2 pictures and then triangulate and create a 3D world with triangulation. How do you do that on the fly? You're really, really clever. You must have gone to really good triangulation school. Can you remember that time? The teacher shouting out to you, come on, which one of the 2 is closer? Come on, triangulate. I can't do it. I can't do the maths. Did that happen? No. The bit of your brain that knows how to gauge depth by comparing 2 images, that bit grew. It knew how to do that. And the bit of your brain that recognise that the opposite sex is actually pretty sexy, that bit of the brain, it might have taken a bit longer for that bit to grow, but eventually that bit of the brain grew too. Nobody taught you, nobody had to teach you these things. You are a creature largely of instinct. But there are people some of them are called social scientists, who cling to the idea that the brain is an exception. Everything evolved, but not the brain. The brain is infinitely plastic, and our mind, the creation of the brain, is created solely by nurture. Because their field of study is based on the idea that we can blame everything about the way we turn out on our upbringing, on our parents, on the food we were given, on life. And it's got nothing to do with nature. And part of the reason for this might be to do with the history of ideas. Some people will say, oh, no. As soon as you start talking about, for instance, the innate difference between men and women in their instincts, they say, oh, no, I don't believe in all that. Why don't you believe in it? Well, it's the history of ideas, because people in the past have used the notion that men and women might have different instincts in order to then justify something else which today we don't approve of. That doesn't mean that it's not true, though. And for myself, I don't care about the history of ideas. What I care about is this thing true? But that's really upsetting and offensive. I don't care. Is it true? Truth trumps everything. And that's what I'm interested in. So, yeah, if the evidence points to men and women having innately different instincts, actually, men and women, of course, mostly have the same instincts, but there are some differences. There are a few differences, and those are mainly by degree rather than by kind. But there are, nevertheless, differences between the instincts of men and women. And the ordinary man in the street knows this is true. Anyone who's been married will probably be acutely aware of the fact that the instincts of men and women are quite definitely different. The notion that men and women are the same upstairs is so stupid that only an intellectual could believe it. But there are a lot of intellectuals in this world, and they tend to write a lot in the papers. So there are ideas that people say, oh, but that's really counterintuitive. That can't be right. One of these came up recently. Someone, a Facebook friend of mine, was pointing out that there was an article which was supposedly counterintuitive, that yet another study had come up with the same result, which was that the differences between the sexes are exaggerated in countries where men and women are brought up more equally. This study was done by a load of Swedes. So there's this notion that the reason that women don't go into mechanical engineering and men don't go into child rearing is all to do with nurture. They've been told what they're supposed to do by society, etc., etc. But study after study finds that this just isn't the case. And a very good example is the kibbutz. The first kibbutz, these are sort of farming communes that were set up in Israel. The first one I think was in 1909. And the kibbutzniks, the people in the kibbutzim, which I think is the Hebrew plural of kibbutz, but anyway, they were given identical, not in all of them, but a lot of them were given identical upbringings. And before you chose what job you eventually went into as an adult, you had to do all the different jobs available, try them all out so you knew what they involved, and then you could choose. And the kibbutzniks divided along sex lines far more markedly than people in mainstream society do. So the women had tried some of the farming jobs that involved an awful lot of heavy lifting and being out in bad weather, and they thought, this isn't for me. And they tried long, lonely, and sometimes dangerous guard duty, carrying a gun, and they decided, you know what? I want to be where there are other people, and I don't like the danger, so they didn't choose those. Whereas the guys, they all worked in the kindergarten, and most of them decided, you know what, looking after kids, it's just not my thing. Oh yeah, it's fine, I'm glad someone does it, but it's just not my thing. So they actually divided more markedly along sex lines than mainstream society. And in modern Sweden, the psychological difference between men and women is more marked than it is in supposedly less equal societies. And there are people who say, but that's really counterintuitive. I don't personally think it is counterintuitive. I think it's more counter-inculcation, because most of us brought up in modern societies have been pounded and pounded for our entire lives with the idea that the reason women don't go into mechanical engineering is because society has discouraged them from doing so, and that if more women did go into mechanical engineering, that would be good because, I don't know, that's never really explained. Women make better mechanical engineers, and it's somehow a problem that there aren't enough women mechanical engineers. I don't know. Presumably women will do different. There's female mechanical engineering. When they design a windmill or something, it'll have that feminine touch. It'll somehow be good. I don't know. But it's presented as a problem. And it could, though, be that if you fix... Actually, there's another analogy. I'm going to go for an analogy. Right, I want you to think of a field. And the field has... all fields, let's say all fields for convenience are rectangular. So here's a field. And it has length and it has width. So what is the area of the field? Well, it's the length times the width, right? So what is responsible for the area of a field? Is it the length or the width? I think you'll agree that it's got to be both, hasn't it? How do humans turn out? Well, it's partly nature and it's partly nurture. So what's responsible for the way humans turn out? Again, it's got to be both, hasn't it? If someone's born with terrific genes, but then they're not fed and they're kept in a dark room, and they'll just die, so they won't turn into an adult at all. So obviously you need nurture, but it doesn't matter how you bring up a child, it will never grow up to be an adult squirrel. And if you get a squirrel baby and bring it up with your own child in your own home and give it human food and send it to school, it won't grow up into a human. An analogy I love for this, sorry, this is another digression within the digression, but there's an analogy of the exposed but undeveloped photograph. I wish this analogy were mine, and I also wish it were a bit more up to date, because you young folk all use digital cameras, but just in case you're unfamiliar with the film camera, talk to some old folk and they'll tell you of the happy old days when you used to take a photograph and then keep the film in the dark and send it off to a chemist somewhere, and that chemist would then put developing fluid on it that would develop the various layers of emulsion on the acetate, and then put fixatives on to keep them there, and then wash that stuff off with water, and then in the post a week or two later you would get back your pictures. Oh, happy days. Anyway, imagine that someone goes, click, they take a photograph and it's properly in focus and properly exposed, they've done a good job, and they then don't send it to a laboratory, but instead just expose it to life. They just put it out there and life randomly splashes on bits of developing fluid and bits of fixative and bits of water, but maybe not always in the right order and maybe not evenly across the picture. So maybe at the top of the picture, the greens are really brought out, but the blues don't get any of the developing fluid that would bring out the blues. But they get some fixative on, but then other bits of the picture don't get any developing fluid on at all. Then they just get the fixative on and then it gets printed. So that bit of the photograph didn't come out at all. So maybe you were born with the genes to be the world's greatest tennis player, but you were brought up in some part of the world where they didn't play tennis and you never even picked up a racket until you were in your 50s, and it was too late then. So that's, nurture didn't bring out that bit of the photograph. Okay. One of the reasons I really like this analogy is that you can say that it doesn't matter what fluid is splashed on in what order. There is no, if someone takes a photograph of, let's say, the Taj Mahal, no amount of life experience will turn that photograph into Sydney Opera House or a squirrel. You have to have, the genes are your potential, and nurture brings out and accentuates different bits of that potential, but you have to have both. You have to have the width and the length of the field. So, when you look at the field, it becomes quite obvious you've got to multiply one measurement by the other to get the area. So it also, I would say, is, with the analogy of the field, quite obvious that if you fix one, then the variability is entirely dependent on the other. So if all fields are 100 yards wide, what determines the area of a field? Answer, the length. The thing which is still a variable. If one is fixed, then the one that is variable determines the area of the field. So if all fields are 100 yards wide, only the length will determine the area of a field. So what if the entire human species just went infertile overnight because of the great curse? I don't know, cosmic rays or something. So, but then someone invents a way of cloning a human cell and then turning it into babies, but only one cell. So everyone in the entire world gets a clone of the same child. Well, then humanity can carry on. Oh, except you need two, wouldn't you? A boy and a girl. Never mind, that's a complication. We can just live with that for the moment. But would all those children turn out to be the same? But they've all got exactly the same DNA. So yeah, no, they wouldn't, because nurture will be different. All the babies sent to China with parents that speak Cantonese or Mandarin or one of the other Chinese languages, they will end up speaking Chinese, and they'll be given a Chinese education and a Chinese view of the world and its politics and history and so forth. The babies sent to France, doesn't bear thinking about. The ones sent to Brazil will end up speaking Portuguese and dancing the samba. So nurture will be entirely responsible for the differences between all those children and the way they turn out, because the nature is fixed. Okay? You with me so far? Well, that means that if you go the other way, if you fix nurture, all the difference between people will be explicable by nature. So if you bring little Swedish girls and little Swedish boys up in exactly the same way, then you should expect the difference between them to be exaggerated by nature. It'll be entirely explicable by nature. And study after study finds precisely that. I don't think people should be surprised, but it seems that they are. I suppose I should say something about my sponsor. My sponsor is The Great Courses Plus, and they have a course on this sort of thing, Understanding the Mysteries of Human Behaviour. And if you go to www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige, you can take advantage of an offer there, of a free trial, and you can look at all the myriad, in fact it's greater than a myriad, how should I explain that? A lot of people don't know what the word myriad means. 100 is 10 to the third, 1,000, 10 to the fourth, myriad, 10 to the fifth. It means 100, or 10,000 if you like. It's not just a poetic term meaning ever so many. Anyway, so there are over a myriad, well over a myriad lectures that you can see there on all sorts of topics, how to do photography, how to cook, history, geography, science, you name it. And one of them is Understanding the Mysteries of Human Behaviour. And it's one of the courses that you can, if you want, buy separately. If you want just that course, you can pay $9.99 and you get access to that course. But if you're a full member, then you can just look at any number of them and watch them any number of times and so forth. So there you go. There's another way in if you want. And the Understanding the Mysteries of Human Behaviour is actually talking a lot about what I've been talking about. They got lectures on why do we dream, for instance. Why do we feel stress? I mean, stress is meant to be a bad thing, isn't it? Stress is meant to, if you feel stressed, you're meant to be less healthy and less effective. So why do we feel stress at all? Wouldn't it be better if we just didn't feel stress? Why do we forget stuff? Some people remember everything, and the brain, it seems, stores just about everything. So why can't we recall everything? That would be so useful. Why do we forget stuff? And what else have they got? Why do we blush is another one. So there are various lectures in the course that answer all sorts of different questions about this sort of thing. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, there's a lecture course for you on The Great Courses Plus. There are no exams, which is pretty handy. Oh, and the site has been optimized. That's the word they use, optimized now for people in Australia and the UK. I know that in the past, some people in the EU have had trouble paying with certain methods. Anyway, but you should have no trouble now if you're American, British or Australian. And it's possible for anyone to join, but some of you, I know, it still can be a little bit awkward. And now at this point, I would normally be showing you a clip, wouldn't I, from some of the lectures in the course that I'm talking about, and we could discuss it with mirth and at length, or the quality of their various scholars' cradles and so forth. But unfortunately, copyright reasons, I'm not allowed to do that anymore. So that that particular avenue of gags has been closed off for me. But anyway, rest assured that the lecturers they pick are from prestigious universities, most of them American, but not all. And so they got very well qualified lecturers talking about all the various topics. So The Great Courses Plus, you can type out what I said to you before, www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/Lindybeige. I've got to get it right. Or you can just click the description click the link in the description is all I meant to say, which is so much easier, even if I can't say it. But there you go. I'm a professional at this sort of thing. So now back to the action. I was talking about how weird stuff can be explained. Now I was at the ICA, the International Centre for Arts in London, and it's smack in the centre of London, a very prestigious venue, and I was at a conference, this is years ago, and there was a speaker there. It divided into two camps. The evolutionary psychologists saying that it's both nature and nurture, and the social scientists who were saying no, it's all nurture. And they would then accuse the evolutionary psychologists of saying that it was all nature, which is just untrue. No evolutionary psychologist is saying that. I've never met one stupid enough. And one of these, I could name him, but I'm not going to. One of these social scientists got up there, and my word, he was an arrogant, sarcastic guy. He said that it was ridiculous that the evolutionary psychologist was saying that emotions have a function. What a ridiculous notion. He said, I can't see the function of grief, he said, and he presented this as evidence for grief's having no function. Which is, I would say, an act of extraordinary, jaw-dropping ignorance and lack of imagination, but also amazing arrogance. That he couldn't think of a reason that people felt grief was somehow evidence that people didn't feel grief. Really? If I can't solve this sum, the sum must have no solution. Really? Is that logical? I don't think it is. I was a little bit unimpressed, but it made me think, well, that's a weird one, because grief is not only grief is an easy one to explain, but some of you might be thinking, hang on, why do we feel grief? I mean, it's a negative emotion. It makes you feel bad. It doesn't solve any problems. Why do we feel grief? Well, I would say that we feel grief because it's very important to rehearse bad feelings, because then we will take steps to avoid those bad feelings. So if you know that you would feel grief if your child died, then you will go to a lot of effort to make sure that your child doesn't. So you have to be able to rehearse the feeling of grief. You have to know that you would feel this, and it also has to be involuntary, that you couldn't opt out. You couldn't choose not to feel grief. You would, if your child died, definitely feel grief. And because you know you can't opt out, and you can't opt out because it's an innate emotion, you can't opt out of innate emotions, and that's why they work. And unfortunately, in the case of grief, it has to hurt in order to work. Then you will take steps to avoid your child's death. And when you're hit by grief, because perhaps your child does die, other people will see that you are hit by grief. Don't forget that humans are social animals. We evolved as hunter-gatherers. Other people, that you wouldn't be living in a little lonely flat in a tower block where no one sees you. You would be out in the wood with all the other hunter-gatherers, and they would see that you're grieving and would see you needed a bit of help and support. And that's one way of getting support. You can't hide the fact that you need support because you're grieving, and you can't opt out of grief. So it's got to hurt, I'm afraid, in order to do its job. And it's got to be mandatory, if you like. You can't opt out. It's got to be something you have no control over. But there's more to it. Imagine that I've got a friend, and he dies, falls off a cliff, and I go, that's inconvenient. Oh well, maybe, do you want to be my friend? Would you want to be my friend? I mean, if you saw that I cared so little for my supposed best friend, he fell off a cliff and died, would you think that I'm someone you'd want to ally with? Could you trust me to care for you, to really care anything much about you? I put it to you that if you witnessed a complete callous lack of grief, that you would not want to be my ally. And if a human cannot form alliances, a human being a social creature, that human is in deep, deep trouble. You have to show that you care about other people. You have to have a capacity to feel grief. And I'll take this further. I would say that this explains, for instance, why people love tragic stories. Oh, I saw such a sad film last night. Oh, I had a lovely cry, someone might say. And why might someone who's just seen a very sad film get a warm, fuzzy, enjoyable glow feeling from a really, really sad film and having a lovely cry? Well, because that person, I put it to you, was rehearsing bad emotions. We have many, many bad, it's not just grief, but there are many other negative emotions. And if we listen to horror stories and stories of trials and tribulations, in fact, almost any story really, in order to be a good story, has to have bad bits in it, a setback. Even if it has a happy ending, the hero has to go through bad times and lose friends and suffer setbacks before eventually perhaps winning in the end. And if he doesn't win in the end, it's still a good story. You've got to have setbacks and tragedy. Something's got to be at stake. You've got to have loss. And we rehearse these feelings of fear. So people love horror. Personally, I don't really like horror movies, but it's not because they're scary, it's because I think they're pointless. But we like rehearsing these negative emotions in the safe environment of a fantasy, of a story. But this only works if we're really, really good at telling the difference between fantasy and reality. And I think we are really good. And if we see a film and you think, well, is this actually a true story? Did this really happen? It matters to us. We want to know, is it true? And we have a very strong feeling of whether a story might be true or not. And if we felt the same level of grief when we heard a story about a little boy who went into the wood and died, then that would be a negative thing that wouldn't work. That would hold us back. But if we're able to rehearse it and feel just enough of that grief to know that we would, if a son of ours actually died, we would feel that, then we're prepared. We will make the effort. Now, this is something that explains why people feel grief. This explains why people love tragic stories and rehearsing negative emotions through stories and films and escapism. It also explains why people are so good at telling the difference between fantasy and fiction. I mean, I must have seen, oh goodness knows how many, I've seen myriads of people killed in films and on television. And yet it hasn't traumatized me at all, because I knew that it was just a fantasy. When I watch Lord of the Rings and all those orcs get killed, they're just guys in costumes. I know that. And even when the heroes die, he's just an actor. He's not actually dead. Sean Bean, not actually dead. And so part of me is aware that I don't actually need to put grief into full grief mode. I can rehearse safely. So anyway, it explains all these things. But you could say, well, it's not really a theory. See, that's really a hypothesis. I've explained all these things, and I've formed what you might call a hypothesis rather than a theory. A theory is different from a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea that might explain how we behave very strangely. Well, here's a hypothesis to explain it. Does it fit the facts? Yes. Does it? It's based on observation, so it is actually science. It's based on observation, and it explains lots of things, and it fits the general evolutionary theory. So yeah, this hypothesis is a strong hypothesis, but you could say, oh no, that's just a just so story. It's not really backed up anything. It's not proper science. Yes, it's part of science. Evolutionary psychology is very definitely a science, because these hypotheses are testable and they're based on observation of reality. And if something is based on observation of reality, explains several different things, and is testable, then that is science. And my goodness, what a database evolutionary psychology has got to work with. The entirety of human behavior, that's a pretty big database. And all of history and pretty much all of human biology as well. In my department, actually, most of the evolutionary psychologists were looking at animal behavior and then drawing inferences applicable to humans. And again, it was all countable stuff. How many times did that seagull groom that other seagull? And under what circumstances? And had gifts been involved? Was there reciprocity here? It's observable, it's countable, it is science. And I can remember in the late 1990s thinking that this was going to sweep other forms of psychology, well, at least some of them, away. And it seems that some of those other forms of psychology have proven a little bit more persistent than I had imagined. But evolutionary psychology, it's a proper science, and it lets you deal with the weirdness of humans. I tell you, I think I'm a much happier as well. I think I'm a happier person for understanding evolutionary psychology, and I think I understand people so much better. I can remember when I was a teenager, I was just baffled by so many things about the way humans behave, and now I think, oh yeah, right, it all makes sense now. And it offers comfort as well, in ways that other forms of psychology sometimes don't. If you go to someone and say, I'm terribly shy, I'm really, really shy, and I don't know why this is, and I'm painfully shy, and this is really holding me back. And some branches of psychology will look for something in your nurture to blame. The reason you're shy is because your mother behaved like this and your brother behaved like that. And though your brother didn't end up painfully shy, even though he was brought up in the same house by the same parents and sent to the same school, why didn't he turn up? He was given the same nurture as you, but he didn't, because of, we'll think of something. We'll come up with some experience that happened when you were 14, and that is why you're painfully shy. And you go, is that why I'm painfully shy? One, you might not necessarily be convinced. And two, having something to blame doesn't cure you. Oh, great. So I'm screwed up now because of this thing that happened to me when I was 14. And oh, now how am I going to get over this? Or you can look at it from an evolutionary psychology point of view and say, well, actually, you've got an innate nature. And though your shyness might have been brought out by stuff, it's probably just you. You're probably just naturally shy. In fact, genes that correlate with shyness have actually been found. And studies to look into how helped people feel have found that people feel more helped by that. They go, oh, I see. So I don't have anyone to blame, really. I'm just shy. I suppose I should just get on with the rest of my life and just accept that some people are a bit shy, and there are usually advantages to being a bit shy. A friend of mine, he did a study into anxiety, and he looked at an awful lot of stats. He had loads and loads of statistics with very, very solid psychometric tests which showed that these people had anxiety levels of X, Y, and Z. And he looked at people who were very anxious and not very anxious and everything in between. And he actually looked how many of these people then later had an accident. How many of these people then later went on to break a leg, be involved in a car crash, whatever. And he found, looking at the data, which is part of the entirety of human behavior, he found that people with high anxiety scores ended up having fewer accidents. So yeah, that would explain how that could have evolved. Obviously, if everyone's incredibly anxious, that's not going to work. But if some people are a little bit anxious, that's actually going to give them a little bit of edge in that particular field. So yeah, evolutionary psychology. It's fascinating, it's funny, it explains the daft way we are, and it's science. Lindybeige!